Welcome everyone to this launch of the report on G7 leadership for sustainable, resilient and inclusive economic recovery and growth. The report is being launched today and has been authored by Lord Nick Stern, who is known to many. Nick has been a long-standing professor at the London School of Economics, served as the chief economist of both the EBRD and the World Bank, is a member of the House of Lords. But since the publication of the Stern Review in 2006, has been perhaps the most vocal voice in the world, arguing for the economics of climate change and the feasibility of making a green transition. Nick's last book was called Why Are We Waiting? The Logic, Urgency, and Promise of Tackling Climate Change. And it feels like the world has been listening, and never before has there been as much political momentum in support of moving toward a greener economy. Voices from the young, from business leaders, and from politicians of every political stripe. So not only do we have the actors on the world stage calling for change, but the stage is also set with the upcoming COP26 in Glasgow. Today, Nick is going to give us the script. What should the world do to achieve sustainable, resilient, and inclusive economic recovery and growth? And in that script, which he's prepared for G7 leaders, he will outline what the world needs to do and how we could go about doing it. So we will turn to Nick now, who will present the findings of his report, and then we will have time for questions afterwards. Nick, over to you.
Thank you very much, Minouche, and thank you to the LSE for being the place where you can do these things. The G7 has many strands. There'll be different teams working away in the G7 governments across the G7. But we're at a moment where we have to act decisively and strategically to restore growth and combat unemployment, combat the virus, and to change the form of development and growth. This is a special moment when we have to put all the bits, all the strands together into an overarching strategy for recovery and growth, which is sustainable, resilient, and inclusive. That's the challenge. Arising from a couple of conversations last year with the Prime Minister, he asked through the G7 Sherpa, Jonathan Black, for us to explore, to set out such an overarching strategy. And that's what we've tried to do here. We've had support from the Cabinet Office in doing that. We've interacted quite a bit with the different G7 teams, and then more recently with people from the other G7 countries. But I should emphasize very clearly and strongly that this is an independent report. The government is not committed to the findings. And in any case, we wouldn't have done a report unless it was independent. So that independence is very important. But I think it's fair to say that it was asked for, and that there has been a strong interest and strong interaction, and we look forward to continuing that interaction. The team, now there'll be some slides here which will be up on the website and freely available. Bob Wood, who's part of the team, is very kindly going to share the screen and put up the first slide. On the right hand side, that's the front page of the report. But I wanted to emphasize that this has been a team at the LSE. Go back one slide, please, Bob. Yeah, this is a team at the LSE, and those are the people there. The team led by Josue Tanaka, Amar Bhattacharya, Hans-Peter Lankes, Roberto Pierfederici, James Ridge, Charlotte Taylor, and Bob himself. They're part of the team, and we've been joined in this work with a team from Systemic, the firm Systemic, which for transparency, I chair the board there. But that team, Julia Turner, Mark Meldrum, and Jeremy Oppenheim, were very helpful in realizing this report. I'm deeply grateful to all of them. The supports, the financial support that we got, including Cabinet Office and the Quality Climate Foundation, is set out in that report. You'll notice that it's a summary report. Actually, it's 19 pages, and there's a 3-page summary of the summary report at the front. The longer report will be published in a couple of weeks' time with lots more detail, more than 100 pages or so. That's why this one is called a summary, even if it's already 19 pages. A really easy read, though. You just download it and look it through. You'll enjoy. What's the guts of the story? Well, we have two crises, the climate crisis and the COVID crisis. Both of them really deep, the climate crisis potentially still deeper and much longer lasting than the really awful COVID crisis. The COVID crisis emerged after a pretty tough decade, a decade of falling productivity, a decade in which we saw sort of fraying in social cohesion, a decade in which we saw the climate crisis and the challenge to biodiversity deepening still further. It wasn't a good decade running up to the COVID crisis, and then the COVID crisis burst over that. The recovery now will be driven, or should be driven, this is the argument of the report, by investment and innovation. Increased investment and of the right kind, and that's what we try to set out, including, of course, how that investment is brought forward, the kinds of policies that are necessary, the kind of finance that's necessary, and particularly the kind of collaboration across nations that's necessary. I've been doing economics of development, public policy growth now for well over 50 years, and I've never seen a moment where collaboration and commitment are more important than now. We really are at a fork in the road. We can create something much better than what went before, or we can stutter and hesitate and not do what we should do. Then we risk a decade which is worse than the last, and indeed a decade which sets us on a very bad course for the future in terms of climate and biodiversity. So that's the guts of the story, and let me now move into telling that story fairly rapidly. So next slide, please, Bob. Let's start with the challenges and opportunities. Next slide, please. So I've already argued we had a bad decade coming up to the COVID crisis. We had a decade with inadequate and falling investment rates as a share of GDP in the G7 countries, and much slower rates of growth of investment than had been there previously in the rest of much of the rest of the world. It led to the idea of secular stagnation, planned saving a lot bigger than planned investment. And of course, the right answer to that is to increase investment. We did see fraying of social cohesion, faltering of internationalism, and rising emissions, destruction of biodiversity. Not a good decade. Next slide, please. Then along came COVID, and you can, I don't have to rehearse the details of that. I hope that those sad details are familiar to us all, but drop in growth rates, indeed negative growth, rise in poverty, severe debt issues in much of the world, mass unemployment, destruction of human capital, children out of school, and so on. COVID came on top of the previous rather dim decade, and looking to the future, this coming decade, unless we act strongly, it's a danger of a real lost decade for development. Next slide, please. So these are the challenges then arising from that description. Their challenges which health and social challenges, output and employment and economic, environmental, climate, biodiversity, and inequality. Challenges across all four fronts. And if we just focus on one or just focus on the other, we will actually hinder progress on all four together. It's got to be an integrated story, and it's got to be strong, and it's got to be international. Next slide, please. Now, the Carbis Bay Summit in the first part of June in Cornwall, near St. Ives, is an opportunity, the G7 presidency, the summit of the G7 presidency, perhaps the first summit where people are able really to get together in person for quite a while. That's a moment when we can really get together and change things and set out the commitment to change things. We have to realize just how good this investment opportunity is. The drive to net zero is a story of growth, full of extraordinary opportunity. And we're already seeing the remarkable technical progress that's coming through to augment and characterize these opportunities. There's increasing commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals agreed in 2015, and in particular to net zero targets in countries and in businesses across the world, in the community as a whole, and particularly amongst young people. And it's actually a joy to see that, the young people really being strongly and clearly, forcefully and in a well-informed way on the right side of history. And of course, that period of low interest rates is a real opportunity to up investment. But it's got to be strong, coordinated across the world, and the G7 is the right place to start that story, to lead that story. But it's going to be all countries moving together. Just the G7 summit is coming up now, next month. And of course, those are the strongest economies in the world. They have a duty to move strongly. In order for this to happen, it's got to be determined, it needs strong leadership, it's got to be coordinated. Next slide, please. I hope this is revision for you, those of you who've seen me talk or seen anybody talk on climate change in the recent past. The red line is basically current policies sending us above 3 degrees centigrade in increase in average global surface temperature relative to the second half of the 19th century, which is the usual benchmark. We're already just over 1 degree above, so we've already seen just over 1 degrees. The target, which makes sense, is the 1.5 degrees centigrade target. I don't have to rehearse the extreme risks involved, but at 3 degrees, where we haven't been for 3 million years as a planet, when sea levels were 10 to 20 meters higher than now, for example, would be extreme risk to lives and livelihoods, hundreds of millions, probably billions having to move, and consequences, including widespread, severe and extended conflict. Those are the stakes we're playing for. If we're going to hold to 2 degrees, we've got to go down that yellow path, 1.5 degree, the green path, basically starting to turn down almost immediately. And in terms of CO2, this vertical axis is CO2e equivalent, but in terms of CO2 going to net zero by around 2050. Remember, if you want to stabilize temperatures, you've got to stabilize concentrations. If you want to stabilize concentrations, you've got to go to net zero. And the earlier you go to net zero, the lower the temperature for which you stabilize. So we really have to accelerate. Last slide, I did argue that there were increasing commitments, and there are, including the major emitters forum last month called by President Biden. Those commitments are going up, but we're still quite a long way short of where we need to be. Next slide, please. And again, I hope this is a bit of revision. If we get this right, as I've underlined, this is the growth story of the 21st century. But it's a growth story which is friendly to the environment, brings emissions down. It's a story first of increasing demand and sharpening supply in these next few years. And then, as we're already seeing begin, a Schumpeterian story of innovation, creativity, investment and growth. And there's no long run high carbon growth story, it self-destructs. This is the growth story of this century with multiple benefits right across the board, including cities where we can move and breathe and be productive and ecosystems which are robust and fruitful. But we do have to invest to get there. The fact that it has so many wins doesn't mean that it's easy. We're going to have to invest and innovate to get there, but it's a story not of cost, it's a story of investment and innovation. And we have to realize that investment and innovation. We have to invest in ways which are resilient right across the board, because climate change is happening and will happen. And we have to think about how we manage the dislocation that will be involved in this fundamental change. That dislocation comes in terms of places of work and how we work, and of course it comes in terms of some changing relative prices. So we speak the language now of a just transition. It's both the right thing to do and in any case, it does matter to the whole political economy of getting it done. Next slide, please. So what's the picture look like? Next slide, please. So these are the tasks: the pandemic, restoring the growth, creating the jobs of the future, confronting inequality, and tackling these great threats around environment, climate, biodiversity. Those are the criteria, if you like. We have to move on all those, and of course they're very close to the Sustainable Development Goals if you unpack them. Next slide, please. What do we need to invest in? Physical, natural, human, and social capital, all of those things. The focus in this work is mostly physical and including natural. But we do, and it's going to be a very important part of the growth story as we move forward, we have to think about human and social capital as well. But our emphasis here is on mostly physical and natural capital. Central to the physical capital is sustainable infrastructure. Natural capital I've emphasized, of course, but we are going to have to think about driving innovation and skills. If we get it right, the economic multipliers can be very powerful and they can act quickly. And we're going to discover and go forward in terms of technologies and different ways of doing things. Not just, of course, technologies, it's the different ways of doing things, the different ways in which we manage our cities and our land and so on. That's not narrowly technological progress, but it is innovation and change. And if we get it right, there will be tremendous new job opportunities there in this stronger growth story. And of course, it's a much lower pollution story, and it's poorer people who get hit earliest and hardest from pollution, just as they get hit earliest and hardest from climate change, just as they get hit earliest and hardest from COVID. Next slide. Oh, just a moment. I just wanted to emphasize that story at the bottom. So we can see the challenges, we can see what we have to do, and we'll be developing in this story more detail on what we have to do. But it's the commitment to ambitious and strong response is crucially important. It's not that we're just going to feel our way and try a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Of course, we're going to learn along the way, but we have to be ambitious, and we have to be ambitious now. Caution and hesitation are the most risky options. All the options are risky, but ambition is much less risky than the others. Next slide, please. So these are the elements. I won't dwell on them here because I'm going to try to set them out in more detail in what comes. But the clear investment, you've got the clear investment incentives and expectations, you've got to have a strong strategy. We've got to remember it's not just the quantity of investment, it's the quality, in particular, sustainability, inclusiveness, and resilience. Investment requires a prudent macro framework. This is a story of growth, but as we grow and as we re-establish growth, then we're going to have to think about the fiscal responsibility that can maintain a stable framework that allows that growth to continue. And confidence in that will be an important part of the story. Structural policies across the board in relation to carbon pricing, design of cities, regulations that can help to drive to net zero, and so on. Those are all going to be part of the story. We'll set that out in a little more detail. And of course, the right kind of finance in the right place at the right time requires moving the whole financial system much more strongly towards sustainability. And we must recognize that even though this is directed mostly to the G7, that the debt and fiscal financial crises facing emerging market and developing countries are severe. And if the world's going to drive out of this, then the rich countries must help the poorer countries, and substantially, in tackling those issues. Next slide, please. If we do get it right, the returns to collaboration are remarkable. And that's why I said at the beginning that I've never seen a moment where the returns to collaboration and commitment are higher than now. We teach our students, and correctly, about the gains from trade and the importance of internationalism in ideas and so on. All that's correct. But what we've got now is on top of all that. Because we've got a lot of unemployment, then collaboration in increasing demand becomes something that really does give mutual benefit. Because, you know, if you increase demand in one country, some of that will spill over into demand and employment in another country. But if we all move together, we all get the benefits. Secondly, this is a story about stronger investment and innovation. If we have clear expectations around the shared strategy, you know that people are all moving in that direction, you can expect good demand from those investments, and that will draw the investments through. Thirdly, innovation. Well, we're seeing remarkable cost reductions from scale, remarkable cost reductions from commitment to sense of direction. Solar PV has come down by a factor of 10, storage by something similar, offshore wind by something not so far away. These are remarkable cost reductions, and they're in big areas. You're seeing that beginning now in electric vehicles and other alternatives to the internal combustion engine. The stronger the sense of direction and understanding of where we're going, the faster will be the innovation and the cost reduction. And of course, we're talking about global public goods here: climate change, biodiversity loss, environmental degradation. Those four reasons are all those four elements of the return to collaboration are all very powerful. That's why this is such a special moment where we have to emphasize the importance of collaboration and a shared vision. Next slide, please. So let's go into a little bit more detail on the investment. In the report itself, particularly the longer version, there's much more detail. Next slide, please. So I've emphasized right through this that investment and innovation are at the center, and it's physical, natural capital along with human and social. I want to emphasize the intangible assets as well, particularly around the digital economy. So much of what we're going to do will involve know-how and ideas, including and indeed particularly around the digital economy. The digital economy is going to be extremely important in managing the big systems. There are four big systems here: cities, energy, transport, and land. And in all of them, how we manage those systems, how those systems develop, is going to be extremely important. So innovation, not simply on the sort of the physical side of the technology, but also in the way we organize and the way we make best use through those systems of new ways of doing things. Most of the investment will be private sector, although there's going to have to be, in the early stages, quite a strong public investment element in all this. Some of the public investment will need to be front-loaded, including in some parts of the infrastructure. But there are real opportunities for employment, opportunities for people in different circumstances, and to really restore the greater growth of productivity. The multipliers involved here: think of restoring degraded land, think of retrofitting buildings, think of rolling out broadband, think of changing public transport, think of changing the way our cities function. All of those are areas where early on in this process, you would expect to see quite strong multipliers, so they can play quite a strong element in the recovery, as well as in the drive to a different form of investment. Next slide, please. Again, a little more detail on the story. Electricity generation is a really big part of this. There's a very good report issued on April 27th by the Energy Transition Commission. I'm a small part of that, but that's led by Ajay Mathur and Adair Turner. And that shows that if we invest in a way that more or less quadruples our electricity between now and mid-century and makes it all clean, zero carbon, that we can get most of the way towards net zero. And that we can do that on a fairly modest increase in investment levels. But we will have to increase our investment levels. Energy efficiency, transport, and so on, all big parts of the story. Very important to keep the recognition of resilience, nature, agriculture running right through this. And of course, so much that matters around making much more efficient use of all our resources, including the ideas from the circular economy. So all these are very exciting opportunities for investment, but they've got to have the right macro framework, fiscal framework, structural policies, and finance. Next slide, please. How big should that expansion of investment be? Well, it'll be different in different places, but for the G7, we suggest an extra 2 percentage points of GDP. Where does that come from? Well, I think there's three arguments which are they overlap and they're mutually reinforcing. They're not additive, they mutually reinforce. The first is that if you look at the G7 countries, there has been a decline over this last decade, and indeed a little before, in the investment rates. They've come down in the G7 countries by a couple of percentage points of GDP. Of course, there have been ups and downs. There was a global financial crisis, which saw big drops, and then there has been a collapse in investment during COVID. But basically, if you look at that story, we have been in G7 countries a couple of percentage points lower than where we were 15 or so years ago. Reversing that decline will have a big difference in productivity and demand for good jobs across the G7. If you look at various analyses of infrastructure spending, there's one from the Council of Economic Advisors in the United States, important work led by Amar Bhattacharya. It's a 2016 Brookings publication on infrastructure, also from the Grantham Institute. Some of us, including myself, were parts of that. If you look at the infrastructure shortfalls in terms of, in rich countries particularly, the delay in looking at deterioration, the sort of delayed renovations that are necessary. If you look at particularly emerging markets, developing countries, the infrastructure drags on growth, the infrastructure is necessary to increase growth. Again, you get 2 or 3 percentage points of GDP. And in the calculations that we did for this report on where the opportunities lie for the sustainable investments and how big they are, again, you get to numbers like this. We'll find they'll be different in different countries. We'll find out when we embark on this just what we need. But that's the ballpark at the moment. And these are investments which will have very high returns in terms of productivity, new opportunities, environment, and so on. So we do have to increase our investment, but we should see it as exactly that, an increase in investment for a better future across so many different dimensions, not as a cost. We have to do it. We have to have the policies to bring it through, but it paves the way to something that's much better. Next slide, please. Now, investment's about expectations. And most of this is private sector investment, not all, of course, but most of it private sector investment. And that means that expectations on the profitability of that investment and expectations on the stability of future growth are extremely important, and expectations on the nature of future growth. We've got to be predictable at the same time as being flexible. Predictably flexible is at the core of good policy in terms of generating investment. So that's critical. There will need to be, particularly in the importance of infrastructure, some front loading of public investment in this story, even though the majority of investment will be clearly private sector. If you want to create the stability or the anticipation of stability, you've got to think about the fiscal. But now what we have to do is organize our fiscal policies across G7 and beyond in ways which will give people confidence in growth and will give people confidence in the return to budgetary responsibility. Putting those two things together will be extremely important, growth and budgetary responsibility. And that is something which we got wrong after the global financial crisis. We slapped into or dived into, whatever verb you use, austerity much too quickly. And that slowed growth and gave us a bad decade. We mustn't make that mistake again, but at the same time, we've got to build the fiscal responsibility and the growth together. The key thing is getting growth going. Next slide, please. So now let me run through quickly the particular priorities which we suggest the G7 should adopt. Those are summarized at the front of the report, and there are recommendations, if you like, for the highlights of the communique to come out of Carbis Bay. But that, of course, is a matter for the G7 countries to choose themselves. Next slide, please. So first is the vision that we have to set out, and more specifically, we have to begin with the virus and vaccinations and treatments. The kind of collaboration that I've described across investment would be undermined if we failed to collaborate on the most basic issue of common humanity, which is vaccines and treatments around the virus. We have a duty to do that. We have mutual responsibility, a recognition of our common humanity, and of course self-interest, because whilst the virus is spreading and intensifying elsewhere, we ourselves will be at risk. But surely common humanity and mutual responsibility are the first arguments. So that is number one, and that is not something that's so expensive, and it's something we can do quickly. So strong commitment there on the effective vaccines and treatments available everywhere, no later than the end of 2022, next year. The countries of the world have made increased commitments on climate. It's actually rather promising for COP26 at the President Biden's Leaders Summit of last month on the Major Economies Forum on net zero emissions. Those were very important. It built on commitments which were made first, of course, by the UK in the summer of 2019 to go net zero by 2050, made by the EU later in 2019, China, September last year, net zero by 2060, quickly followed by Japan and South Korea, net zero by 2050, and now, of course, the Biden administration as well. So those commitments are coming through, but of course, what we do in this decade will be extremely important. You can't backload all this to sometime closer to 2050. It's the cumulative emissions that count, and we must avoid locking in dirty investment, dirty infrastructure. We must act on biodiversity and the environment quickly. So what we do in this decade, and our commitments for 2030, particularly in the nationally determined contributions associated with the Paris Agreement, which must be intensified ahead of COP26, that's the challenge. Are we going to come in now with strong, effective policies to deliver for 2030 on the way to net zero by 2050? That's a big challenge. It's I've emphasized natural capital throughout. 30 by 30, protection of 30% of land and ocean areas by 2030 is extremely important. The UK has played a leading role in the Global Ocean Alliance here, and that's something to which more and more countries should be drawn to. And I've already emphasized the 2 percentage points of GDP in the G7 countries for this decade and beyond. This is a long story of important investments, very attractive investments. That's around $1 trillion a year from now until 2030 for the G7. Very high return investments if we get it right. Next slide, please. So delivery, well, a price on carbon is very important. Joe Stiglitz and I have indicated that a price of carbon, $100 a ton by 2030 is what we should be looking for. And of course, eliminating any remaining fossil fuel subsidies quickly, no later than 2025. Important right across the world, not just the G7 for that. I think an international carbon price floor would be very valuable in that story, together with border adjustments for particular industries, energy intensive, trade exposed. In that, steel would be the first item on the agenda. There are only 3 or 4 of those. Of course, they're responsible for quite a bit of emissions, but this doesn't have to be a border adjustment across all areas of activity. They're just 3 or 4 important areas for which those border adjustments would be particularly relevant. The story, of course, is not simply a price story. Clear targets on and clear standards can make investors much more confident about where things are going. Think about the abolition of the incandescent light bulb and how quickly that drew through new ways of doing things, particularly the LCDs. Phasing out of the internal combustion engine sales is one clear example of that. We must phase out coal power generation around the world very quickly, and the G7 countries can play a leading role in that, including in ending overseas support for coal power generation and soon after other fossil fuels. The commitment to a just transition will be not only the right thing to do, but also very important to the political economy of getting things done. And we have to move hard and move strongly on R&D and innovation. That is a big part of the story of change, and it will involve investing. And the G7 countries, actually the UK in particular, could well be leaders on that story. So we can lead the way, the G7 can lead the way, net zero emissions, climate resilience, and drive forward growth and help restore social cohesion. Next slide, please. So we've spoken about the level and nature of investment. We've spoken about the policies, and particularly the clarity of the sense of direction, but we will need the right kind of finance in the right place at the right time. So just a few key points of that story. The public finances will need restoring across the G7 and across the world. One way we can do that is to move together and not get involved in races to the bottom on taxation. That's why, for example, the idea of a minimum tax rate on corporate profits could be part of that story. I've already suggested a minimum carbon price. The whole financial system has to move much more strongly to the new kinds of investments, the investments of the future. And one way of doing that would be to have mandatory disclosure of the climate-related financial risks. The Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, which was established by Mark Carney when he was in the chair of the BIS and delivered by Mike Bloomberg, sets out very clearly what's involved there. We should move to make that mandatory as opposed to voluntary very quickly and across all G7 countries. I haven't got this is not the place to go into in great detail into the debt challenges facing lower income and vulnerable countries, but they are extremely important. We have a debt service suspension initiative, which is okay as far as it goes, but it can go very far. That has to be strengthened. And also the G20 common framework agreed last year for debt treatments, which will have to involve some reduction of the cost of official debt, of course, bring in private sector. And there are opportunities, debt for nature, debt for climate swaps as well. That's the first part of the finance story. Next slide, please. Secondly, and continuing that story, the 100 billion per year target for flows of climate finance from rich countries to poor countries was set in first in 2009 at COP15 in Copenhagen. That wasn't really a strong agreement, but it was built into next year at COP16 in Cancun, and it was a cornerstone of the Paris Agreement, COP21 in 2015. And it will be a very important part of the story of the success of COP26. So reaching that 100 billion, which was designated for last year, we can achieve it this year, but it will involve extra climate finance, particularly from the G7 countries. They should be doubling the climate finance, raise its quality, focus more on grants, and we must deliver that 100 billion per year target this year. It's crucial for the credibility of the rich countries' position in leading leading action on climate change. We have agreed informally as a world to special drawing rights of 500 billion or $650 billion. At the IMF, we need to formalize that agreement and support, we as a world, I mean, need to support the reallocation mechanisms. The special drawing rights go to countries of the IMF according to their quotas, and those are then voluntarily reallocated into funds that can help particularly poorer countries and stabilize. So that will be a challenge now of these coming months to set those mechanisms in place. And there should be new programs, of course, particularly for vulnerable countries and vaccination and health, but also to promote the green transition. The multilateral development banks will play a big part in the story. They need to scale up their lending, particularly in the context of the crisis, but also for supporting a green recovery and the drive to net zero and fighting biodiversity loss. IDA replenishment this year, very important. MDBs can make better use of their balance sheets, but they'll need help and understanding of the risks that could be involved in that. They need to focus more strongly on private sector mobilization, alignment with the Paris Agreement. But if we push as a world the MDBs to act more strongly, to get bigger flows, we've got to recognize that they'll run up against their capital constraints earlier than they otherwise would have done. So as we push them, we must also support them in providing not only for the IDA replenishment, but also as they start to approach their capital constraints, to look to the replenishment of their capital position and do it in a way that brings the MDBs together around a common agenda and helps them work better together. Next slide, please. So this is the next slide, please. So this is the last part of what I want to say. I've underlined when I've emphasized, the Keynesian demand story, the expectations and investment story, the driving down of costs, and the importance of the global public goods around climate, environment, biodiversity. For all four reasons, the arguments for moving strongly and together are enormously powerful. As I said at the beginning, more powerful than I've seen in more than 50 years of working on development, growth, and public policy. The G7 have the resources and skills to lead that story. And indeed, they have the duty to lead that story. So this will be a moment when the G7 can chart that course of action. It can work closely with the Italian G20 presidency of this year, and of course, Italy as co-presidents of COP26. And we also have, next year, Germany chairing the G7, Indonesia chairing the G20, and the year after that, Japan chairing the G7 and India chairing the G20. And India, of course, coming to the G7 at Carbis Bay next month. This is a special moment when we have a chance to have clear, strong, strategic, overarching strategy over the next 3 years from this sequence of G7, G20 presidencies. So there has never been a more important moment to act together. We have the machinery to act together. I think we have the understanding to act together. What we now need is the decisions. And if that does take place, I think we can see 2021 as a turning point. Get it right, and it's a much more attractive, prosperous, and sustainable future for all, with stronger poverty reduction across the world. Get it wrong, lost decade for development, and a very unpleasant sentence in terms of what follows for the generations that follow us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Nick, for that incredibly comprehensive and compelling analysis of the challenges we face. I'll encourage participants to put questions in the chat, but also to vote for existing questions that you'd like to see answered so I can direct them to Nick. And I'm going to start, Nick, with a question from our old friend Ian Golden, who writes from Oxford University. Thank you for so clearly laying out the urgently required, compelling, transformative agenda and the opportunities it provides. Over the past year, rich countries have created 16 trillion for themselves, but allocated under 1% of that, 100 billion, to developing countries. And the UK has cut its aid by almost a third. What needs to happen for the UK to play a catalytic role at this G7 and take your urgently needed actions forward? And what can we all do to support this?
Thank you very much, Ian. And if you probably look over my shoulder, you can probably see your book Rescues sitting alongside Minouche's book, What We Owe Each Other. And of course, my own book's there too. So thank you, Ian. In looking at the 16 trillion, let me take it in two parts, Ian. Looking at the 16 trillion and then how do we get change? I think the 16 trillion should be seen as largely rescue. The rescue is trying to stop firms falling apart, trying to stop people from being unemployed, trying to support their incomes whilst they're on furlough. That's essentially taking a picture of the world economy, excuse me. That's taking a picture of the world economy as it is and trying to sustain that picture in the very short term. That's rescue. You wouldn't expect that to be radically different because that's the logic. It's just sustaining what you find. And if you find a pretty brown economy as you do, then in the very short run, that's what you're sustaining. I think the challenge comes now as we start to move from rescue to recovery. The rescue period lasted longer than we might, well, naively or otherwise, the rescue period lasted longer than we'd hoped a year or so ago. And in large measure, we're still in it. So the challenge now is for the recovery to be something different. And I think the way that we have to begin to get that is a vision of what's possible, a vision of what's attractive, a vision of what we need to do, something that's hopeful and positive. And that's the story that I've tried to tell. That hopeful, positive story that it's in our hands, that we can do it, that increasingly we can list and set out the investments that we need to make. We can describe the policies as we've tried to do to make that happen. So that story of a very attractive future, if we make the effort, if we get it right, if we do it this way, recognizing that we're going to learn a lot along the way, of course. That story, that narrative, if you like, I think is fundamental. And we need the leaders of the G7 to embrace, not just accept, to embrace that narrative and start to act on it. So as academics, as storytellers, analytical storytellers, but as these analytical storytellers, it's our duty to set that out and set it out strongly and engage strongly with the countries of the world. Politically also, I think we can look to our young people, and one of the great joys of being a university professor is you get older, but they stay the same age. And you see the different cohorts coming through. And my goodness, this is a different cohort from 20 years ago. They understand the challenges, they recognize the responsibilities, they demand action, but deeper than that, they understand what's possible. And so I think the pressures of the young people are extremely important in this politics. So it's a combination of we as analyzers making the argument, the private sector as investors recognizing what's possible and what's attractive and increasingly they do, the people making particularly the younger people pressing, and the politicians leading. And it's that package that we all have to play our part in that can lead lead to change.
Okay, thank you, Nick. I've got another question from another old friend, Jamie Drummond, who has done a great deal to nudge the G7 in different directions over the years. And he asks, can you give a sense of which G7 countries are more in favor of this approach that you've outlined, and which are harder to crack and persuade? And share your views on the more global side of this, including on aid, SDR recycling, and multilateral development bank optimization.
Thank you very much, Jamie. And it would have been very nice to go for a drink afterwards, but that's for a future world. For those of you who don't know, long ago, Jamie and I collaborated on Make Poverty History in 2005 and earlier than that. And those, I mention it because those challenges for development and sustainable development are still with us. But I do think that the winds are better for mutual action and sustainable development than perhaps they were then, and certainly than they were a few years ago. On aid, this is a moment for strong aid, strong support for the developing world, not only because of the crisis of COVID, very importantly because of that, but also because the investments that we now need to make as a world have to be investments which are very valuable, attractive investments. They have to take place, they have to be financed. And this is a moment where we will all gain by supporting strong change elsewhere, not only in our own countries. For this reason, I think that the decision to reduce our aid from 0.7 to 0.5% of GDP was a mistake. And it's described as temporary. I hope it's very temporary and we get back very quickly to where we should be on 0.7. The UK has a very good record. It was the first country in the G7 to declare for net zero by 2050. That commitment shared across the political spectrum to 0.7% on aid. And of course, and the strengths of DFID in delivering good aid were very important in the UK's position in the world. I sat there, Minouche was there in these international institutions. I was there as chief economist of the World Bank and the EBRD. We saw the UK, partly because of its experience in aid, partly because of the levels of aid, punching above its weight in a good sense, in world decision making. So I do think that reduction from 0.7 to 0.5 was an error. It is declared to be temporary. I never refer to it without adding the adjective temporary, and we have to make it as temporary as possible. So keep going on that, Jamie. I probably shouldn't point my finger at this G7 country or that G7 country. I mean, United States, of course, is very different this year from last year. The movement in Germany seems to be quite strongly in a green direction. So countries change. We ourselves moved quite strongly in the UK. There are some parts of the G7, I mean Japan, for example, that has gone more slowly on coal, although Japan has declared for net zero by 2050. So there is change everywhere. I think we should act together as collaborators, as the G7, rather than trying to pick off one by one as the one that's dragging its feet. I do think there's a sense for change. We've shared this report with trusted friends in all the G7 countries, at least I should say the ideas in the report rather than the report. We've shared the ideas in the report with trusted friends in other countries. And initially that feedback has been quite positive. So I would express the spirit in the collaborative way, these huge opportunities, let's work together rather than pointing fingers.
Great, thank you, Nick. I'm very proud of the fact that the 0.7 target in the legislation was passed when I was the permanent secretary at the department, and I always say the law says 0.7. That's what the law still says, and that hasn't changed. Next question is from Joe Paisley, who asks, does the report address the need to tax carbon consumption, not just production?
Well, if you tax the production sufficiently broadly, you're taxing the consumption as well. But I would certainly take the point that a lot, particularly in the UK, but in many countries that have moved very strongly to service sectors and import quite a lot of their manufacturing goods, that if you measure the carbon associated with them through consumption, you get a very different picture from production. And the carbon in our consumption is much higher than the carbon in our production because we import a lot of carbon intensive goods, or goods which are more intensive than the goods we produce ourselves, partly because we are now 80% service sector. So I think that we should recognize that. Probably the best way forward is to encourage as many countries as possible to put on carbon taxes and carbon prices. But we should, I think, and to be fair, the Climate Change Committee does do this, show the graphs of changing carbon for the UK, both in production terms and in consumption terms. And the picture does look different. I think you should publish them both. It's not that one is analytically superior to the other. They're both relevant. If countries export to us, then they gain. We're mutually responsible, as it were, for, and vice versa. We're mutually responsible for those emissions. So I would publish both figures and not, as it were, say one is superior to the other. But we must take responsibility for our consumption along with our production.
So a question from Ed Davey. How hopeful are you, Nick, that China and India, after the current crisis, can also pursue these ideas in a leadership role?
I'm increasingly confident. I and many of us at the LSE have worked very closely with India and China. I've been personally working in India for nearly 50 years and China for well over 30 years. And ideas in those countries are changing. A lot of the innovation that we need is coming from China and increasingly actually from India. A lot of the demonstration of what's possible is coming from China and India. In India, you now see a cost of round-the-clock solar coming down below 3 cents a kilowatt hour. It is quite remarkable. So those countries are changing for a collection of reasons in terms of their thinking and action around sustainable development. The first reason is that they know that they're hugely vulnerable to climate change, both India and China. And if you look at the Himalayas, it's a nice thing to look at, but if you look at the Himalayas, the big rivers of the world, if you go all the way around from the Yellow to the Yangtze, to the Mekong, to the Ganges, to the Indus, and all the way around, those big rivers come off the Himalayas. The billions of people are dependent on those flows. They could be dry in the dry seasons. They could be unimaginable torrents in the rainy seasons without the glaciers and snow on the Himalayas. So many of the countries around the world, including in India and China, are on the coast, and they're very vulnerable to storm surges and climate change. Big parts of Northeast India and Northeast China could experience in the next 50, 60 years or so, outside temperatures higher than human beings can sustain for more than a few hours without being in danger of life. So those countries are enormously vulnerable to climate change. And that's and there are lots of analytical, thoughtful people in both countries. So that vulnerability is recognized. Increasingly, the connection with climate action and air pollution is recognized. The dirtiest cities in the world are in India the loss of life from air pollution is immense. You know, you're talking about 50+ million people in the world dying each year. Something close to 10 million of those deaths are associated with air pollution. Some of it inside, some of it outside. But both countries are seeing that strong connection of climate action and reduction in air pollution. Both countries are seeing the technologies coming through, partly from themselves. Now, they'd quite like to be leaders in a green race, and good luck to them if they are. So I think they're starting to see, for all those reasons, that this makes sense as a much better way to development. And it's going to be much easier to realize that route to development if we move together. It's a very big change, which economists actually have been a bit slow on. There's still a lock-in to the idea that clean is more expensive than dirty and everybody will free ride. That's the economics of the last century. What we're seeing now is that clean is in many areas cheaper than dirty, even without a carbon price or a subsidy, that many people want to behave in a responsible way. They see the marriage, if you like, between responsibility and strong economic returns. And they see the economics not as static, but how to realize very rapid change in structures. So I am optimistic about both China and India. In India's case, China's very good at financing its own investment. In India's case, some strong help with that finance story, I think will be very important.
Good, thank you. The next one is from Anita Bhatia, who's the Assistant Secretary General and Deputy Executive Director of UN Women. And she asked, do you see countries being able to factor in a gender lens in the policies needed? And if so, how? What incentives need to be created for this to happen?
Oh, I certainly hope so. I mean, if you think about some of the things that I was describing just now, on the whole, air pollution, particularly internal air pollution, is something that hits women and children particularly hard. Disruption in water is something that hits women and children particularly hard, because in many societies it's their duty or perceived duty to go and collect the water. You know, if you look at air and water, you see very clearly how vulnerable women are to pollution and climate change. If you look at the opportunities, again, you have to forgive me for focusing a bit on village India, but that's where a lot of my work has been over the years. There are a lot of opportunities in decentralized solar. For example, since in most of those communities, women leave the home less often than men, with decentralized solar, you can use your panels to charge up other people's mobile phones and lamps and so on. A lot of these new ways of doing things will require new skills. And in many countries, you know, women are the underutilized workforce, and many of those new skills, digital, for example, I've already given the example with the decentralized solar. In many societies, it's not so easy for women to own vehicles or to drive. Vehicles are not as easy. Increased public transport, which will be a big part of that story, should be something which would benefit women a bit more than men. So both in terms of the production side and how that's organized, and in terms of consumption, and in terms of damage that women incur under the existing system, I think the benefit to women should be clear and strong. How to make that happen better? I think that, okay, you know, for example, it's going to need a range of things. I think decentralized solar is something where microfinance can be very important, and there's quite strong evidence that women look after finance and loans rather better than men do. So that's an area where I think tilting the financial structure towards women could have a strong payoff. I could go on, but Anita, I mean, this is such a big and important subject, and more power to your elbow in UN Women.
Okay, let me turn to a question by Jonathan Said from TBI in Africa. What would it take for G7 countries to properly start supporting industrialization strategies of low-income countries, such that their objectives of job creation can be achieved at the same time their green compliance can be maximized? The risk I see at the moment is that we focus on the green part, but not on the industrialization part, and fear this will be highly counterproductive.
Yeah, Jonathan, it's policies, technology, and finance. And there's a kind of implicit thing in your question, which I wouldn't go along with, which is contrasting growth and industrialization and green. That's just a mistake. This is a story where these new kinds of investments that we can see are actually more productive and stronger in poverty reduction than the dirty alternatives. Now, coal, the use of coal is damaging in the short run, is damaging in the long run. It's not particularly labor intensive. So I did feel underlying that question, there was a kind of horse race between industrialization and green, and I wanted to be very clear that I think that is wrong, and it's increasingly wrong, and it's a lesson we've learned very strongly in these last 10 years or so. The future of industrialization is strong, and it looks different from the industrialization that we've seen in the past, much greener and less dirty, and with more job opportunities and better ways of living. But we have to get there. So I tried to describe today some of the policies that are involved in doing that. I think sharing technology and know-how, this actually is not technology with a lot of patents in it. It's not like a drug with a patented technology, but a lot of it is around know-how. And that, I think, you know, how you run grids, how you integrate those with decentralized electricity, both in consumption and in generation. There's quite a lot of know-how that matters in doing that sort of thing. So the right help with the right kind of policies, help with the know-how, recognizing, as I tried to say in an earlier question, that we're going to learn quite a lot from what developing countries are doing for our ways of doing things in rich countries as well. And finance. Finance is going to be extremely important. In the world over this last couple of decades, the finance has sort of flowed uphill. It's flowed from poorer countries to richer countries and gone into, you know, housing booms in richer countries. The greater productivity for investment is in emerging markets and developing countries. So we have to try to organize our financial system so that finance flows, as it were, to where its rewards are higher. And that involves a lot of management of risk. And that involves, you know, some disclosure and clarity in the private sector. But I think it does involve the increasing use of development banks, both national and multilateral. And that's a very important part. I discussed aid earlier, and that's a crucial part of the story as well.
One from Marion Oseu from the World Wildlife Fund. How can we leverage the SDGs to ensure these critical transformations benefit the most vulnerable?
I think it would begin with setting criteria clearly. We saw the Millennium Development Goals come in, you know, at the millennium, and they were, as it were, asking us to set targets and judge development, set criteria for development and objectives in relation to income, education, health, and to some extent the environment. And that, of course, looked beyond simply income to education, health. It added the environment and to some extent issues around inequality and gender. But the Sustainable Development Goals went far beyond that. And they placed inequality at center stage. looked more deeply into education and health, looked more deeply into gender issues, and as the title says, Sustainable Development Goals, they put sustainability to center stage. So I think those two landmarks, the MDGs and the SDGs, represent a change in our understanding of what development means. And we have to bring those criteria to all decisions. More recently, I think, because the SDGs came in 2015, I think the last 5 or 6 years has seen a much deeper understanding of the loss of natural capital and the importance of measuring and investing in natural capital. So the first part of the answer, I think, is criteria and measurement. The second part of the answer would lie in policies. And what we have to do is to work in ways that natural capital is not only measured, but also we can organize ourselves so that we can invest in natural capital. For example, there's a lot of discussion now of carbon offsets, and Clara Firth has been charged. Clara Firth, who's not only an alum of the London School of Economics, but previously did lead the other LSE, the London Stock Exchange. But the carbon offset story, which is becoming quite strong now, with so many firms dedicated to net zero and needing to offset whilst they move to reduce their own emissions. It's extremely important that in those markets which are developing and will develop, we look not only at negative emissions, we look also at natural capital and building ways of valuing that. There may be some mileage. You have to work on the detail on debt for nature swaps as we recast our, at the moment, overly stressed out debt position for many emerging markets and developing countries. So criteria, measurement, policies of various kinds to try to put value on the natural capital will be a big part of that story. Not, of course, forgetting the health and the education along with the growth, but I oriented my answer more to the natural capital side.
I want to take a couple of questions on this issue of how we measure things, and then I want to turn to some questions on distributional issues. So one from Nako Ishii, who's a professor at the University of Tokyo, who asked, how can we bring a role for natural capital at the center stage of the G7 policy focus? Finance ministers are yet to pay enough attention to natural capital despite the environmental emergency. And then a question from Hans-Peter Lankes, who's another old friend of both of us, who in reaction to Ian Golden's point, argues that we should work to reframe how government and society think about assistance for the climate. It's classified and thought of as aid, but in fact, it's an investment in common global public goods. And should we change the language around aid in order to start to change the politics? And so should we move away from thinking about aid to thinking about investing in global public goods? And what do you think of that argument?
Thank you. And those are two questions from real leaders, as I hope your audience will recognize. Naoko Ishii has a long distinguished record of leadership on global environment, and Hans-Peter through the EBRD and the IFC. And now, of course, Hans-Peter is a visiting professor at the London School of Economics, most importantly. On Naoki's point, I think we're starting to get finance ministers to move in a good direction. I don't want to get too excited too early, but for example, we have now, I think, more than 90 countries involved in Network on Greening Financial System. That's mostly central banks. And we have more than 60 involved in the coalition of finance ministers on climate action. And the UK has played a strong role, actually, in both of those. I don't think we would have predicted that 6 or 7 years ago. And I think the fact that central bank governors and the finance ministers are so directly involved, I think is very important. In the last budget, Rishi Sunak changed the remit of the Bank of England to look at and take into account of the Monetary Policy Committee to take into account net zero. So I think they're starting to move. Is it fast enough? No. But is there movement? Yes. So the challenge, I think, is to keep up that story. So to keep politics to in the political discussion around these issues, so that finance ministers feel, and many of them would want to lead, but they feel that they've got, as it were, a political wind in order to do that. Part of that political wind comes from the private sector. More and more, the private sector is recognizing that to act responsibly across the whole story of green, from climate to environment, biodiversity, the whole integrated mix, they're seeing that to act responsibly is actually also to do better under conventional bottom lines. All sorts of reasons for that, including that the best young people want to go and work for you if you're a more responsible firm, but also more and more that customers take that into account, and indeed potential investors. So I think that movement is happening, but that politics to be built up through the reality of economic investment in responsible ways being more powerful, being seen as more profitable, and the political pressures in the population as a whole. The measurement points that Hans Peter raises, I think, could well be part of that story. We've often, I think the arguments for aid and mutual support begin with common humanity and mutual responsibility. And I wouldn't want to move it away from there. But the argument of common self-interest, I think, is beyond mutual responsibility and beyond common humanity. Mutual self-interest is, I think, something which we're realizing more and more. I mean, air pollution is clearly one where we recognize mutual self-interest at the local level. And I think with climate and biodiversity, we have to recognize that mutual self-interest at the global level. And if you do that, then the picture on aid starts to look different. It's actually investing in the global public goods of the world. And I think it's in addition to the arguments about common humanity and mutual responsibility. But the more we measure these things, and the more we bring them out in the criteria that we're using to judge performance, in the company level, the individual level, particularly government level, I think the stronger the arguments will be.
Okay. Nick, I want to take two questions around distribution and burden sharing issues. One from William Young, who's from the Bloomberg New Economy Forum, Council on Geostrategy and LSE Ideas alumna. And he asked, how might the UK and the G7 mitigate the risks of backlash from more carbon-intensive producing countries to the EU's expected proposal for a carbon border adjustment mechanism? And on a related distributional burden sharing kind of question, I have from Dane Kirkopoulou, who's the chief economist and director of research and chair of the Sustainable Policy Institute at the Official Monetary and Financial Institutions Forum, and who asks, there's growing concern around the redistributive implications of climate action, with more and more voices drawing attention to the need to ensure the transition is just. What do you see the role of the G7 here in the developed versus developing economies context?
Thank you for those. On the border adjustment mechanisms, I risk of emphasizing it again. I've been around a long time in the development business, and I think I've heard all the arguments for protection, and they're mostly wrong. But in this case, from the theoretical point of view, it's not actually wrong to say that if you are producing things in a clean way and other people are producing things in a dirty way, so that their costs of production that they face don't reflect the real costs of what they're doing, that you should take that into account. And under WTO rules, that is quite rightly legitimate. At the same time, we've been around long enough to see that even if there are some right arguments for border adjustments, there's a risk that they will be abused for protectionist purposes. And I think that is a real risk. And it's perceived as a risk by many developing countries. And I think there are a few ways to try to tackle that. The first is to focus only where it's relevant. For most goods, the big bulk of goods, a carbon price or border price adjustment would be extremely small, not worth the bother of all the administrative stories that would be needed to make it happen. And as I said, open to abuse. There's very little evidence of, outside just a few narrow industries, of economic activity migrating to the dirty. It's just the empirical evidence on that is not very strong. So many other things matter, you know, the infrastructure and the skills and the relative prices and so on, and looking to the future, because it's dirty now doesn't mean it'll be dirty forever. So it's not very big, the migration of economic activity. But there are a few industries, and they're important, where it does matter. And we speak of those as energy intensive, trade exposed industries. Steel and cement are often raised first, some aspects of plastics, bits and some materials. The most important in my view is steel, and that's the where you would start. Cement, less important because it's so heavy, you don't ship it around all that much. So yes, the argument is right. Yes, it can be misused, but use the evidence to see where it really matters, quantitatively and in terms of economic history. And there I would start with steel. And we know that you can make steel in a clean way now. You can make it with hydrogen, and that hydrogen can be clean. But it's a good deal more expensive to make it that way now. And what we want to do is to incentivize steel being made that way. So put money into research and development, share the ideas, but in the meantime, in some cases, you may well want a border tax adjustment for steel. And you can tell, it's not so complicated administratively. You can tell how that steel was made and the carbon content of that steel. So that's the way I would approach it. It's focused and it's transparent, and people can see the reasons for doing it, and it incentivizes change in a good direction. On the just transition, there are quite a lot of aspects of that which will require thoughtful and strong public policy. If you, and it's obviously of less relevance now in the UK, but if you look across the G7 and other countries, closing down coal mines will be something that affects the welfare of people and places in quite a strong way. And that's something where you have to invest in those people and places, whether it's in India, China, Poland, or Germany, or wherever it may be. So that's dislocation on the production side, which requires investment in people and places. It's not such a nice job going down the mines. We ought to be able to find, and we can, much better ways of earning a living. And a lot of the things that we're pointing to have more labor opportunities than do those high in fossil intensity industries. But that is an important part of the process. On the other side of the market, on the consumer side, some things will become more expensive. Perhaps rather less than we anticipated in the past. Electricity now, renewable plus storage, is actually in most parts of the world already cheaper than fossil fuels. But it's going to take a while before our cars run on zero carbon electricity. And in the meantime, a carbon tax would increase the price of fuels. We can heat our homes in ways that don't use fossil fuels. But for a while, fossil fuels for home heating are the dominant form. And so a carbon tax would increase those costs. There's more than enough revenue potentially from a carbon tax to compensate those people who are worse off. And that should be a big part of the that side of the story, which arises from relative prices. There are other things which the Treasury is doing, and Minouche and I are advising the group in the Treasury working on this. There are other areas where there are important distributional aspects. Richer people buy new cars, so they will be buying the electric cars. So they will be, as it were, moving into that place first, and the poorer people will stay with a little longer with the internal combustion engine, and thus face the cost of the increased price of fuel from a carbon tax. Richer people more likely to have drives that they can park their car in and charge it overnight. So one thing one would have to do was to enable poorer people to have access to better charging facilities. So there are quite a lot, and richer people live in bigger houses, and so the return to investing in insulation would probably be higher for them. So there are quite a lot of practicalities of all this which do matter, which should be an important part of public policy. It would be madness to stop doing what we need to do because of those difficulties. But it also would be unjust if we pursued the direction we have to go without recognizing those difficulties.
Okay, I've got lots of questions coming in. I'm going to try
on developing countries very quickly. The cleaner ways of development are better ways of development. It's a challenge of finance and technology, and we should be supportive in both those. Okay,
I'm going to try and squish 3 questions together to cover them all, Nick. Sorry about that, but I'm sure you can manage. So a question from Sue Wilshire about to what extent has recovery spending so far by the G7 been green or not? So how have they done so far? And then from Chris Hopkins, and Sue is from Tier Fund, which is an NGO. Chris Hopkins from the Green Economy Coalition asks, which structural measures are the most pressing, or can we see a path opening up for? What advice would you give governments as they navigate the liminal space from green stimulus to deeper structural measures? So really this question of how green and how structural has the G7 been and should be going forward. And then just to close, because you've emphasized that a lot of this investment will come from the private sector. Question from Bertrand Badré, who's another old friend, who says government policies have taken the lead, but the private sector will be critical for achieving these objectives. But many doubt the sincerity and genuineness. I believe greater emphasis should be placed on norms, their comparability and their convergence. The worst would be to have competition between the EU, UK, US, and China. Could the G7 basically corral comparability and convergence of private sector approaches?
Yep, very quickly. First question, most of the spending so far has been rescue spending. And as I tried to argue earlier, that's just as we're taking a picture of the economy, brown as it is, and supporting firms and people to keep going. That lasted longer than we thought. The test, and so if you measure that, it looks brown. The big test will be in the recovery, and we must push very hard now for a green recovery, because it's better, it's investing in the jobs of the future as stronger multipliers and so on. The priority areas for investment, I would say electricity, cities and land. And those, so much of what we need to do comes from expanding electricity quickly, using it in transport and heating and making it green. That's the quantitatively the big bulk of the investment in the physical capital. The land, of course, is crucial, and including natural capital there. And a big part of what we need to do is in cities where something like 2/3, 70% of the emissions come. We can organize those in so much better ways. And salut Bertrand, thank you for coming. I completely agree on the norms and the standards. I argued in the talk of, a floor on carbon prices, a floor on corporation taxes, to give clarity and certainty that we're all moving in the same direction. I fully agree with the norms and standards and the transparency. Firms should be publishing what they're doing. In large measure, that's the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. It should be there more generally in natural capital. And that actually shines a light and people take notice. And firms themselves, they're not necessarily wicked organizations. If they start measuring these things that the people as a whole, their customers, their employees, regard as important, that in itself will change the behavior. So, sorry, that was a long way of saying yes, Patel.
Fantastic, Nick. Thank you so much for a great report, hopefully a very influential report, as many of the other things you have written have been. And thank you to the audience for fantastic questions and a really good discussion that I think fleshed out many of the challenges, but also many of the answers to solving these problems. I hope you enjoyed the event. Please do come to future LSE events. And Nick, thank you again for the work that you do. And we all hope to see the G7 embrace the recommendations in this report and put us on a different and better path for the future. Thank you all for joining us, and goodbye.